Vi nästa programpunkt. Arrangör är Jordens, Vänner, Forum Syd och Fian Sverige. Rubriken är Kampen om mark i fattiga länder. Mark har blivit en handelsvara. Hur påverkas lokalbefolkningen? Vilka krav bör ställas på regeringar, företag och finansiärer? Och på scenen så har vi Rebecka Jalvemyr, Kanslichef Fian Sverige, Daniel Ribeiro, Generalsekreterare Jordens, Vänner i Moçambique och Moderator i Kenneth Hermele, Utvecklingsekonom, Forum Syd. Varsågoda.
Yes, and we will switch language to English. So this seminar will be in English. We will discuss the recent phenomenon which has attracted great interest, sometimes called land grabbing, sometimes just called an increased investment in land. And the reason why land has become so important as a commodity and as something that is being invested in during the last 10 years or so is that land has a certain characteristic which is very much looked for, very much in demand. And it is the fact that land provides not only food but also feed for animals, not only food and feed for animals but also fibers, think about cotton or think about paper, and not only food, feed and fibers but also fuels, think about biodiesel or ethanol. So there are increasing movements abroad internationally that are targeting land, and Mozambique is a country which is rich in land. It has a population density which is not extremely high. It's about a little more than 20 million people. I'm checking now with Daniel Ribeiro from Mozambique. So there are land, but land is not free in the sense that it's not being used. It is being used by the Mozambican peasantry. So, and Mozambique has a very unusual land law. As you may know, most constitutions in Africa say that land belongs to the state and does not have private ownership. Peasants have the use right of land, but they don't own it. In addition to that, Mozambican land law acknowledge that there is something called communal land rights. So there is a collective right to land which is based on the traditional use of different communities, villages, among the peasant population. And that is very different from normal way to look at land, because what you have seen during the last couple of decades is an attempt to privatize land. And if you are familiar with the way that many aid organizations and many corporations think, and many international institutions think in relation to land, they say that as soon as you privatize land, as soon as you have private titling to land, the problems of land and the problems of agriculture will be done away with. The Mozambican land law does not go along with that. It says that land is still a common property that belongs to the whole Mozambican people, and it recognizes that there could be not only private or individual land titling, but also collective land titling. This is unusual. I don't know if there are I think one or two more African countries which have this, but it's really very unusual. So many people who are looking at an alternative to privatization of land look to Mozambique as an example, because the Mozambican land law has this unique, almost unique characteristic. So my first question to you, Daniel, then is, so this is the pro forma situation, this is the law. What about reality? Does it have any importance that Mozambique has such a radical land law?
So yeah, what we got on paper is pretty good, and a lot of work was done to get at our laws to protect land and community rights. And the reason why that's important is, if you look at our population, almost 80% of Mozambicans are subsistence-based farmers, producing 90% of the food that's consumed in Mozambique. So this link with the land is very important. That's why the land law represents this. It's something that is to protect that, basically the way most common Mozambican. The problem is when you go into the field and you look at the reality, that's where the problem. Transferring that ideals that was on paper onto the ground is where the problem's occurring. We have a publication that we do every 5 years. The new one's coming out next year, but I've been to the field and not much has changed. And the reality is that most of the projects we visited over 100 projects already, and the law has not been followed fully. Some parts are, some parts aren't. For example, if you look at projects that have community consultation, communities have to be consulted, they have to give consent, there has to be a process where they are left off equally or better off, and it's not happening. The truth is that. There's a lot of pressure for Mozambique, and if you look at Mozambique, why Mozambique represents a lot of interest to a lot of the donors, to the funders of these investments is, first of all, communities are not as respected as an entity in investment. They have less power. They're away from the centers of decision making. They have less capacity to use the legal structures. They're away from a lot of these legal the courts and the tools that are available to protect themselves. And a lot of them aren't aware of the details of the law. So this makes them an easy target. Another reason why there's such an interest in land grab is the way that the political elite see land. If you're an individual in Mozambique, a politician, and you go up the ranks in your political career, from administrator to provincial, sooner or later you want to get economic wealth, and you need capital for that. And in Mozambique, that capital is land. As a political elite, I can get hold of land and use that as my investment. And depending on which bandwagon is happening globally, a while back, agrofuels, now it's plantations, there's different needs for the land at any given time. And our politicians use their political influence to get land, to make these economic partnerships, to start their economic growth. So land is a first stepping stone to get further up the ladder. That's why Mozambique is offering land. I'll just give you some examples of what Mozambique is offering to the world. Mozambique is giving, at the moment, made a partnership with Brazil and Japan. We'll be talking about this in more detail on Saturday. We're talking about 140,000 square kilometers. The size of, if you had to put that into context, a third of Sweden. For Brazilian farmers, they're saying, come farm here. We'll give you all the land you need. Japan is also a partner, because Japan is going to be supplying the chemicals and the machinery, and they're going to be buying up, because one of the main crops is soya. So you can see the scale of what the Mozambique government is offering for investors. And there's a whole bunch of other projects. Plantations is a big trees. And so on the ground, when we look at when our communities consulted, the percentage is very low. If you look at where communities are relocated to, the land is less fertile. They're losing access to water resources and other benefits. And also, if you look at what type of areas they're occupying, in the case of, for example, this project called ProSavana, they're occupying an area which has roads already, has a railway system. The local farmers are linked to markets. So they're not even investing in improving their infrastructure. They're taking the prime areas because they do not want to have any form of investment in terms of creating roads and links to the markets and others. So even the areas they're choosing are not the best, because we do have areas in Mozambique where the farmers are disconnected from markets, don't have access. And if investment came and improved the infrastructure, there could be some form of benefit to counterbalance, but it's not happening that way. So unfortunately, on the ground, we're still far away from getting our law in reality on the ground.
You pointed two different things. One is the imbalance in power. The fact that there is a law doesn't mean that the law is being applied, or that you could say that the people who are supposed to benefit from the law cannot make their case for different reasons. And then you point to another thing, which is the collusion, the cooperation between important foreign international investors. You were mentioning Brazil and Japan, in collaboration with the local Mozambican elite. And this brings us over to you, to the second point here. What if you think there is you have a progressive, a radical law, and you have difficulties of implementing that in reality in Mozambique? Is there any part that some sort of international society could play in supporting the weakest party, which would be the Mozambican peasantry? Rebecka.
Yes, Fian is an international human rights organization working with the right to food. And a lot of the cases that we see around the world are just, as Daniel explained, peasants and indigenous people being displaced from their land. So what we see is that land is essential for the fulfillment of the right to food. And this was stated already in 1990 by the Special Rapporteur for Economical, Social and Cultural Rights, that access to land and land reforms are essential for the fulfillment of the right to food, right to housing, and other economical, social, and cultural rights. So, but this has been increasingly recognized, and in 2012, the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forests were adopted in the Committee for World Food Security. And these guidelines, they were developed by a broad participation of different actors, private sector, public sector, civil society, and academia. So they have quite a variety of principles, and sometimes they are a bit difficult to interpret. But the purpose with these guidelines are just what we've been talking about. The purpose is to stop the development of land grabbing, of a large-scale acquisition of land, and actually to support small-scale farmers and peasants, fishers, herds, and things like that, and marginalized people.
But can I ask you, is it really true that the purpose of the guidelines is to stop large-scale investments?
No, but it encourages methods.
Yes.
For that. Yeah. So, and they are quite unique in that way, that they are the first international instruments that applies an economical, social, and cultural rights perspective on governance of land and fisheries and forests. So, but there are problems with these guidelines, of course. First of all, they are voluntary, and second of all, that we see that different actors, they interpret the guidelines in a way that is good for their own purposes. One example is that of that is CFS Ray. I won't go more deeper into that, but then it's principles for investors for sustainable investments. So they are just using parts of the guidelines for their own purposes. So what is really important there that we need to do is to help civil society, as a civil society, mobilize to get the correct interpretation of these guidelines to work for them to be implemented on a global level. I mean, there's a lot of things that people in Swedish policies that also affect these land grabs in other regions in the world. So, and then, yeah.
Well, one thing is, I think, to try to establish this link between the internal dynamics in Mozambique and the international field. So my one question then coming to you, Daniel, from what Rebecka was just saying is, do you feel any impact of the international global guidelines on the way that land grabs are actually taking place in Mozambique? Is there any relationship to what is happening on the international level?
It's still very early, and it hasn't come down. It's not influencing Mozambican decision-making processes, or even the local groups working with land haven't started promoting it enough. However, the thing is, it's good to have how to do something in a better way. There is a lot of good indicators to direct you in the right way. The problem is getting people to follow those more sustainable and just paths. And that's where, the same way as our law has a lot of potential, it's not getting translated into reality, the guidelines as well are still in a phase where it's hard to use them. But the thing is, as well, is it's also a global mentality, I think. The more we start understanding this. In case of Mozambique, anyone that goes into Mozambique has to realize that the dynamics of a country. We have a situation with corruption. We have, even if you have the right intentions of doing something in the correct way, it's difficult because the country's not working that way. That's why any investor has to be aware of these, and it's prone to putting in situations where they'll be involved in land grabs and without that being the intention. But the thing is, again, it's this mindset internationally, because every time, at least in the South, what we notice is every time there's a global recession, every time there's a financial crisis, everybody looks down to one of the places, Africa. They look at the resources, they look at the land, and every time that happens, and this urgency, and it's a very economic time frame that we look at, and this urgency, these guidelines get pushed aside. When there's a luxury to follow them, we follow them. So it's more of a convenience. If we can, we'll do it. If we can't, it's only, and that's the problem. At the end of the day, if there is a conflict between the economic decision process and the social environmental pushed aside. And until and that's still going to continue to happen.
So the challenge then is to make these very nice wordings on paper actually matter. And we have the problem with the land law, which is nice on paper, but which is not being implemented as the intention was. We have the problems, perhaps. We don't know yet. You say it's still too early to tell. But Rebecka, do you see any impact in the NGO world of the voluntary guidelines? You said one of the problems was that they are voluntary, but you could still see maybe investors adhering to them, or at least paying lip service to them. Do you see anything in that direction?
I haven't seen exactly on the voluntary guidelines. They say that it's on the voluntary guidelines, but for example, one of the biggest investors that we have are the Swedish pension funds. And the Swedish second pension fund, the AP-fonden, Andra AP-fonden, they participated actively in the recommendations for the CFS-RAI, the development of that. So, and that's only a part of the voluntary guidelines. So that's exactly what we need to combat. And we do that, for example, in a campaign that we have on the fair pensions. It's called schysstapensioner.nu, where we try to advocate on the pension funds to invest.
One of the problems, I think, with all of these guidelines and voluntary principles and things like that is that they tell you in very nice and not very concrete words what you are supposed to do. You are supposed to pay more attention to human rights. You are supposed to have all these consultations with people who are being affected. You're supposed to compensate them. But they very rarely tell you what you would not do, where you cannot invest, what is out of the picture. And my personal opinion of these guidelines is that unless they are translated into some sort of conclusion that say, okay, we will follow the guideline, and that means we will not go there. We will not invest in that kind of product. We will not invest in that kind of land. They are useless, or they are, you could say, if you ever see worse things about them, they would be hiding reality, or they would hiding the imbalance of power. But Daniel, maybe the last question will come to you now from the Mozambican point of view. What is the major perspective that we should take from this seminar?
Well, one of the things that we are trying to do is look for alternative ways of using our land. So we're having more and more community ownership and community initiatives. Instead of community seen as part of the process to put aside, even though you have guidelines how to put them aside, we shouldn't think it that way. How can we include them in, because all our model is based on trickle-down economics. This will create economic benefits, and sooner or later it'll reach everyone. It hasn't happened, and it's not going to so soon. So we have to start seeing how they can be included, taken up with the development and not put aside and compensated. And we have a few projects that I'll be with the Friends of the Earth stall, and we can talk about some of the positive stories that we have of how communities have taken ownership. We have communities now are doing the largest rainforest in Southern Africa is community owned, and now they have traditional rights, but now in the process of getting the commercial right to manage the forest. And that will give them even more power, because they'll have both forms of rights, traditional and commercial. And so there's some positive stories to go by.
And those of you who will be interested in talking more to Daniel and to discuss more the Mozambican landlords and these positive tendencies that Daniel is pointing to, you will find Daniel after this seminar right down here. The last word will be to Rebecka.
Yeah, I just need to comment on the thing that the guidelines are voluntary. Yes, they are voluntary, and that's a problem. But human rights, they are international law, and they need to be followed. So that's really, this is just a guideline for helping the governments to follow international conventions that they already signed. So this is not it's a help on the way to follow the international law.
Thank you very much, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
Vi tackar